Welcome to Generation AI, the show where we explore how AI is reshaping our generation. I'm Derek Staahl. This week, AI on the battlefield. We'll speak with an ASU professor about how the Pentagon is using AI to select targets in Iran and whether U.S. law can keep up. Plus, the AI debate coming to a theater near you. We'll speak with two of the filmmakers behind a new AI documentary, the existential questions it's revealing. First, let's get to the headlines. The White House just released its new AI policy framework, and it's calling on Congress to keep state lawmakers out of the game. The 7-point blueprint urges lawmakers to set AI policy at the national level and preempt state laws that slow down U.S. dominance of the industry. It keeps regulations to a minimum, with the exception of rules to protect children and keeping data centers from pushing up electricity costs. The war in Iran isn't just disrupting oil shipments. Helium prices have also spiked, and that could impact the semiconductors needed for AI. Helium is used to cool the silicon disks that get printed with tiny circuits. Spot prices for helium have doubled since the war began. Qatar supplies about a third of the world's helium, and that country has had to shut down production because of attacks from Iran. And millions of Pokemon Go players have been unknowingly training autonomous delivery robots. Pokemon Go is an augmented reality game where players see characters superimposed over the real environment around them. One of the companies behind the game announced it harvested 30 billion images captured by gamers to train short-distance robots that deliver food or groceries. The company says it'll allow the bots to navigate just by looking at landmarks instead of using GPS. Another example that a free app isn't really free. Coming up, war at the speed of AI. We'll hear from the head of the ASU Future Security Initiative about how the Pentagon is using AI in combat. Generation AI continues. In the initial wave of attacks on Iran, the U.S. military says it hit about 1,000 targets in the first 24 hours. That's double the number of targets hit compared to the shock and awe campaign on Iraq in 2003. The difference, according to the Pentagon, is AI. So how exactly is AI transforming the battlefield? My next guest is the co-director at the Future Security Initiative at ASU. He's also the co-editor of a book called Drone Wars: Transforming Conflict Law and Policy. Daniel Rothenberg, welcome to Generation AI.
Thank you so much.
Hey, we're glad you're here. I want to talk about an AI use case in the military that's been getting a lot of attention lately. It's called the Maven Smart System. Walk us through what it is and what it does.
Well, the Maven Smart System, sometimes called MSS, it began initially with this idea that AI would be key to the future of war. It started with Google. It's moved now to Palantir is running the processes whereby various information enters into the system. It uses Claude, the AI program from a large language model from Anthropic, which has been in the news lately.
Oh, yeah.
But basically, a lot of data comes in from a variety of sources: sensors, satellite imagery, any number of different inputs, and it allows for very rapid targeting. And that's made a big difference in the recent conflict.
Yeah, and so essentially it looks like a video game almost, where these operators can see all sorts of satellite imagery, sensor data, etc. And with just a few clicks, they can move from targeting selection to all the way to executing a kill chain, they say, right?
Yes, correct.
And so what is the significance of that speed at which they're able to operate? I think the Pentagon said what used to take them hours or days can now be condensed down to just minutes. What's the significance of that?
Well, speed is the point. I mean, so far, the way in which AI is being used has radically increased the speed by which targets can be determined, and then that can lead to the actual attacks. What's the difference? There's a lot of things going on in Iran that are particular. I mean, it's the current attack was based on the dismantling of a lot of defensive capacities, over quite a few months. So it isn't only the AI that's allowed for this massive number of rapid selection of attacks. It's also the fact that there's been an enormous degrading of the Iran's ability to stop or shoot back at any kind of attack, whether by missiles or by planes. So there's a lot going on in this particular context, but it is really a moment whereby we're witnessing key elements of how war is changing and it gives a sense of sort of the future of war.
Yeah, and the Pentagon thinks this is really a remarkable change. Here's how the Pentagon's chief digital officer described the Maven Smart system at an event this month.
As you can see, it's not just one data feed, it's multiple. And instead of having 8 or 9 systems for those decision makers to look at every single day in order for them to make decisions, you then fuse it into a single visualization tool. So we've gone from identifying the target to now coming up with a course of action to now actioning that target, all from one system. This is revolutionary.
So they call it revolutionary. And as you mentioned, Claude is part of the system. Do we know exactly how Claude is being used and how Claude is helping the Pentagon here?
Those of us in the public, we really don't yet know. I mean, it's clear that this has been an enormously successful operation in terms of selecting targets and destroying them. But there's a lot more to trying to assess what's really going on here and trying to make sense of where all of this is taking us. So speed has been radically increased, but obviously speed is only positive if the data that's coming in is effective and accurate. And there's some reason to believe that that's not always the case.
Yeah, and so you're talking about, I think you're getting at an idea that when the information is wrong, we can have bad outcomes. And we have some video of an attack that went wrong in Iran, a U.S. attack on a school that destroyed a school and killed about 170 people, mostly children. Give us a sense of what may have gone wrong in that case. Do we know if AI was to blame there?
Well, we don't yet know that for sure.
And I mean, what it seems like is the attack in Manab may have been the result of bad information, outdated information that was about 10 years old because the school used to be on the grounds of this military installation. But my question has to do with the speed at which decisions are being made. If decisions on targeting used to take days and they're now condensed into seconds, does that increase the probability of a mistake?
It certainly changes the character of the mistake. So it's long been an issue that poor intelligence and inadequate information can lead to civilian casualties, inaccurate targeting. In the case of the anti-ISIS campaign of a few years ago, it turned out with some serious field research that we learned that the civilian casualty rate was about 35 times higher than the US had thought. Generally, there were sites that were struck because the data was inaccurate, out of date, not usually 10 years out of date, but could be a month out of date or a week out of date. So you raise a really good point, which is if you increase the tempo and the speed of targeting, what system do you have in place to make sure that there is adequate accuracy to determine that the information you're using for targeting is in fact correct?
There also seems to be a phenomenon that researchers are noticing when humans are working with AI, that the human sometimes will start to delegate critical thinking skills to the AI. Is there any concern that if the AI is involved in prioritization of the targets and is involved in, suggesting which weapons to use, that humans might defer more and more of the decision making to AI?
I mean, sure. I think we know this in our own lives. When we use AI, we often go with the suggestion that AI makes, and not necessarily in situations as complex and serious as warfighting. But I think all of the key commitments that the U.S. military has under international and domestic law, specifically say distinction, that is determining, whether minimizing harm to civilians and focusing attacks only on legitimate targets, all of that is extremely difficult in any context of warfare. But if you add to that moving up the tempo so fast that there isn't time to carefully go over what is being presented to you, then there's all kinds of elevated capacity for really terrible outcomes. The attack on the school in Iran is one example, but we could imagine that multiplied many times more, particularly in contexts where, say, the adversary had greater capacity to fight back.
Another interesting use case of AI in this war, it has to do with drones and these new low-cost, uncrewed combat attack system drones, also known as the Lucas drone. Tell us about this. How is this changing the future of war?
So the whole question, I think, with all of this rapidity and information and data, and you couple that with precision weapons, which have now been a key part of U.S. military operations for years, and they've gotten ever more precise in their capacity to strike very particular places. But again, just as a precision weapon, isn't inherently going to strike. It's going to strike the place you want it to strike, but if that target is poorly chosen, then that doesn't achieve your goal. So what's the big fear? The big fear is you're going to see massive use of dangerous, destructive ordnance in a way that is not controlled by human beings. Why does that matter? It matters because the fundamental, precept of war is that human beings are in control of this terrible destructive capacity. Human beings are accountable for those actions, and that we have, decision making should be managed in a way that's in line with our core values and goals. Not just strategic goals, but also moral and ethical goals.
This is something that
the great fear.
Yeah, and this is something that came up recently in a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona was asking a general about whether humans are still in the loop, whether they are still the final decision makers on these Lucas drone strikes, if humans are still giving the final order to strike. The general kind of deferred some of that, saying he would only answer in a classified setting. But then he said this. Take a listen.
Any commander that deploys these systems, just like any weapon system, it has to comply with the law of armed conflict.
I am not sure that the law of armed conflict has dealt with this issue. So LOAC might not be exactly clear, and that's why I think it's up to us, Mr. Chairman, that we take this issue of humans in the loop seriously.
So, Daniel, can you give us a sense of what the law of armed conflict is briefly, and why Senator Kelly might think it's not adequate in the age of AI?
It's not so much that the law's core principles are not adequate. It's that we haven't yet worked out how we run these new technologies through these core principles. Maybe the biggest difference is that the fundamental idea of the law of armed conflict is that human beings making decisions, and so human beings can be held accountable. If you deferred a targeting decision to a machine, who would then be accountable? Would it be the software maker? Would it be, somebody else deep in the system? That would seem a little unlikely. But there's a lot of efforts. I mean, if we want to feel a little bit better about the situation, we've confronted complex destructive technologies in the past and have come up with a variety of ways to regulate them with some degree of effectiveness. Think of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. We've done a pretty good job of non-proliferation, despite what's been talked about. Or think of chemical weapons or biological weapons. There's some decent regulation of those. Landmines, there's some decent regulation of those. So we are in a really complicated moment where it's time for our societies to figure out what's the most effective and responsible way to keep humans in the loop and to make sure that our core values are being integrated into the systems where we use both AI, cyber, precision weapons, all of those, meshed together in the current system we have.
Yeah, you brought up some really interesting kind of international frameworks for non-proliferation, because my next question was going to be, okay, so Senator Mark Kelly wants to ensure that humans are still in the loop. That sounds great. Let's just have Congress pass a law that says the military must have humans in the loop making the final decisions on these drone strikes. But what happens when an adversary like China or Russia has fully autonomous weapons and we are requiring humans in the loop? Does that give us a disadvantage?
I don't think it's just the claim about humans in the loop in some abstract way. I think the point that you began this whole discussion with is key, which is speed. So think of cyber operations. I mean, cyber operations take place in thousandths of a second. So it isn't only that we have to sort of make a claim about humans in the loop, we have to come up with some mechanism whereby we genuinely address the demands of speed, whether it's cyber, whether it's some other kind of targeting system, and yet we also, incorporate core values. Look, this is a genuine challenge. It's not the sort of challenge for which, a quick soundbite or a simple hearing can address. There are a lot of serious folks thinking about this. And I think what we really benefit from hearing from the government, and I think we've heard a little bit of this, certainly from DoD, is that these are real issues. We have to confront them in a genuine, substantive way. And so to take a step back for a second, some aspect of the humans in the loop is not just the targeting decision as it takes place, it's the architecture of the system that we built.
It's fascinating. And really briefly, Daniel, any suggestions on how the U.S. might go about bringing other countries to the table and coming up with an international framework to address these issues?
Well, we have a long history of that. I mean, this is what international treaties and conventions are. We have many, many conventions on all sorts of, regulations, whether it's regulation of air travel or the movement of things from one place to another. And we have quite a few treaties on weapons. And it's a reasonable time. There's been all kinds of preliminary efforts to develop conventions, or at least principles that could become the basis of a convention. I don't want to minimize the complexity of negotiating a convention. And it may also turn out that there's so much logistical difficulty in that perhaps some other sort of system, maybe a bilateral agreement, say, between the US and China, or maybe some other sort of element of this process. But the one thing we need for the future of humanity, quite frankly, is we need a serious mechanism and system and commitment to addressing these issues. These issues are not only dangerous issues for one side or another, they're dangerous issues for humanity in a similar way to, when nuclear weapons were created. The world confronted that with some degree of success. There have not been, the use of nuclear weapons hasn't happened since the end of the Second World War. And that's because of the way in which different countries and peoples got together and made agreements. And, it's a dangerous world, but that has worked at least in that measure.
Yeah, it's the Manhattan Project of our era, for sure. It's such an important topic. Daniel Rothenberg is the co-director of the Future Security Initiative at ASU. Daniel, thanks so much for being on Generation AI.
Thank you so much.
Generation AI will continue right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back to Generation AI. There are some serious people who believe AI is the most powerful technology humanity has ever created. But is it a force for good or the potential undoing of our civilization? That's the premise of a new documentary hitting theaters this Friday, March 27th. It's called The AI Doc, or How I Became an Apocalyptimist.
If this technology goes wrong, it can go quite wrong.
By using AI, we're about to move off of the Earth into the cosmos.
If we can be the most mature version of ourselves, there might be a way through this.
This is the last mistake we'll ever get to make.
Today we're joined by co-director Charlie Tyrrell and co-producer Ted Tremper. Guys, thank you so much for being on Generation AI.
Thank you for having us.
This is a blast. I saw this film last week. Congrats on the film. It's a really, really interesting documentary. And the film basically explores the range of possible outcomes from AI, from a world where we cure disease and fix climate change and stop doing busy work, all the way to a world where a super intelligent AI turns on us. And so I have to ask, after making this film, are you more optimistic, Charlie, or pessimistic about the impact of AI?
It changes every day still. After working on this film for 2.5 years, you'd think I would have some kind of very clear answers, but there's still much more to learn, and it still unfolds in real time.
Yeah, Ted, how about you? Do you feel like the AI is going to make the world a better place?
I think that, the nature of technology is that it's always going to have the capacity to do both. And I think it's there's a person in the film, Carnegie, who says, fundamentally, this isn't a question about AI specifically. It's a question of how do we build a society that can coexist with very strong technology, because we're only going to get stronger and stronger technology.
On that point, the film ends with kind of a call to action and some policy recommendations on, people that are building AI and these companies that are building AI. How hopeful are you that governments can sort of put a seatbelt on AI before the car starts going 200 plus miles an hour?
To be complete, my personal opinion is I'm not very hopeful, unfortunately. I think it's going to be up to citizens, people like you and me, to really make sure that we try and steer it into a more democratic kind of fashion where we can have some influence and impact on what the technology does for us.
Last week, the Trump administration unveiled a new legislative blueprint for AI. It basically emphasizes a minimalist approach to regulation outside of a few things with child safety and the like. It also focuses on preempting state-level rules. Ted, what do you think of the argument that the U.S. needs a unified national approach to AI rather than kind of a patchwork state-level approach?
I think that the most important thing, regardless of whether or not this gets decided by states or the federal government, is that people continue advocating for what their values are and for what they believe in, because this technology is going to continue evolving. And if you can ask yourself, what are the things that I value? How is this affecting me and the people that I care about and the people I care for, you should be shouting that to every level, regardless of who currently is regulating it, because it is a long, long game. We could get into the moratorium that was they tried to put in the big beautiful bill, and 99 senators voted to take it out because the states wanted the rights to regulate it. And it will be an evolving conversation, I think, probably for as long as this country exists. And it's really important that the people are the ones who are advocating for it. This movie is not a political movie. It is a human movie. And the thing that really gives me hope is that insofar as it's affecting everybody, everyone deserves a say, and people will be able to bring about and sort of adjust the current path we're on if they make their voices heard.
Is there one specific ground rule or regulatory approach that you think is most urgent for the public to demand right now?
I would say it is really important to not believe that regulation alone will solve this problem, and for not even it to be looked at as a problem to be solved. The joke I have is, like, if you look at your marriage as a series of problems to be solved, you're going to be miserable. But if you focus on creating boundaries, if you say, these are the values that I have, I'm not going to let it go past a certain way. There are any number of different jokes I can make about my own marriage, but we are co-evolving with technology. Human beings have been since we first picked up a rock and turned it into an axe. This is no different, but the stakes are much higher.
Charlie, AI can be somewhat abstract. You're, of course, in the movie business. You have to bridge those visuals and turn this into a visual movie. And I was really struck by the visuals in this film. It's a really beautiful film. It's a lot of animation. Tell us about the visual choices you were making here.
Yeah, well, a lot of it launched from Daniel, my co-director and the protagonist of the film, being someone who obsessively draws and keeps sketches and keeps notes. So, because we're in his world for this film, keeping it with him, with his drawings, with his space, but also kind of, lending itself to this tactile world of things that we can touch and feel, partly to be antithetical to kind of the digital landscape that you would maybe expect for an AI film, but also just a way to kind of remind us of our own humanity and our own craft. And, it was very important for me as a filmmaker to work with a lot of different film craftspeople on this project and to really elevate that in a story that we're trying to tell, to try and give ourselves some hope that, what we're holding on to is worthwhile.
And you told me that a lot of it is, in fact, stop motion animation. You said you worked with a team of craftspeople on this. Do you worry, though, about the future of Hollywood as AI becomes more common in the filmmaking process, that a lot of those below-the-line jobs will be going away?
Yes, I do worry, but I don't worry that those jobs are going to completely go away. I just think that the big risk is the audiences will probably diminish because there will be less ask for that, and it might just make things that are already very difficult to make even harder to make. So again, in the what's necessary with this technology is we have to be clear about what we're asking for and what we want. If we want, real people making real movies with real actors and real objects, then we'll get that. But if we don't really care and we're okay with a bunch of things that are just completely AI generated, that's what we're going to get. So it's time to speak up.
Yeah, I really like how real feeling this movie is. It's not just an educational movie about AI. There's a real human story at the center of it, led by your co-director, Daniel Rohr, about him having a baby and him and his wife and the fear and the concern about bringing a child into a world like this. Ted, you have a long background in comedy. You did the Borat sequel. You did The Daily Show. What drew you to this project?
Well, you do. Think one of our other producers has been a friend of mine for about 15 years. They made Everything Ever at Once. And for me, the most important thing about anything that is aimed towards education is for it to be entertaining. It's a thing where, my 78-year-old dad who's never owned a laptop before, he divides all movies into two categories, which are movies and think movies. And he's not a big think movie fan. The biggest compliment of this film is that he watched this movie and he was wrapped with the entire time. He leaned in and said wow at one point because of a thing that a specific AI safety expert had said. And at the end of the movie, I asked him a couple of open-ended questions about how the technology works, how would it affect him, where does he think it's going, what does he think needs to be done, and he was able to answer all of those questions. And he didn't know that he had learned that much. And the movie being entertaining, it being human, the overwhelming response that makes me happy is when people watch the movie, they will frequently say, I absolutely didn't expect a documentary about AI to make me laugh and make me cry.
Yeah.
And I think that if we can get that, then we've done something okay.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of emotion in this movie. If you're at home and you're an AI fan, but you want to bring somebody into the conversation, a spouse or family member, this is a great way to introduce someone to the topic of AI. The film is called The AI Doc, or How I Became an Apocalyptimist. It's in theaters March 27th. Charlie Tyrrell, Ted Tremper, thank you both for being on Generation AI.
Thanks so much for having us.
Hey, that does it for us on this week's edition of Generation AI. You can check us out anytime at azfamily.com/GenAI. We will see you in the future.